Great, and I think it is recording now. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the MD PhD panel of the Biomedical Engineering Society's Translational Medicine Day 2022. My name is John Ventura, and I'll be the moderator for the general Q&A portion of this panel. I'm joined by Rachel Lian, who will be moderating the open Q&A portion of this panel. Again, please sign in using the QR code and on the screen or the Google form link in the chat so we can keep track of attendance. First off, thank you so much to our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us, Dr. O'Donnell, Dr. Chi, Dr. King, Dr. Matsutani. We really appreciate your insight into MD, PhD, and related graduate programs, and are really looking forward to whatever advice you guys can give us relating to translational medicine. As for the format of the event, during the general Q&A portion of this panel, some questions will be directed towards certain speakers based on their experience and expertise. However, if any of the other panelists have any thoughts to add to the question, please feel free to speak up anytime. During the open Q&A portion of this panel, audience members can feel free to submit questions in the chat, whether privately or publicly, or raise your hand virtually to be called on to ask a question while unmuted. And I will be repeating the question that anybody has, so everybody knows it. Are there any questions at this time about the format? Oh, and I think Dr. Minuki is just joining us. If not, we'll get started once Dr. Minuki finishes joining. Hi, Dr. Minuki.
Hi, my apologies. I had trouble logging in, but was able to do it through Google somehow.
No worries. We're happy you're here. Thank you again for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, just to reiterate, for the general Q&A portion of this panel, we'll be directing some questions towards certain speakers based on like experience and expertise. But if you guys, or if any of the other panelists have any thoughts, feel free to speak up anytime. So with that, I guess we'll get started. For all the panelists at this moment, can you guys please take a time to introduce yourself? We can start off with Dr. O'Donnell.
Hi, it's great to be here. I always really enjoy attending Translational Medicine Day and glad to be able to do it even in this format. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley UCSF Master of Translational Medicine program. So despite being on an MD PhD admissions panel, my program is neither an MD nor PhD program. But we really are trying to help students figure out how to help advance new healthcare innovation. And I can talk a little bit more about that. But really, the other thing is I look at hundreds of graduate applications every year, and there's a lot of very consistent things that I see in them. So I'm happy to share those insights here.
Great. We can keep going. Dr. King.
Hello, I'm Kevin King. I'm probably more junior. I don't direct a program, but I was trained in medicine and in engineering. My background's in electrical engineering, trained in clinical cardiology, and probably spent about 20% time seeing patients in the CCU and the rest of the time running research lab and teaching courses in bioengineering. My lab focuses on the cell and molecular biology of myocardial infarction and injury to solid organs. And the other part of my lab, we build sensors that we put in and under the legs of patients' beds, and we try and understand the prodromes of hospitalization. So without contacting them, we try and see the physiology that leads to hospitalization.
Thank you, Dr. King. Dr. Matsutani.
Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Matsutani. I'm a MD PhD student at UC San Diego. I just finished defending my thesis over here, so I am very much at the early stages of this whole thingamabobber. Topic of my thesis was using artificial intelligence for cardiac MRI, so basically how to make pretty pictures. And I am interested in doing diagnostic radiology most likely. But I guess I'm probably closer to more the training phase of the MSDP, so I can certainly help answer questions pertaining to that.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Chi.
Yeah, thank you all of you for the invitation to actually join this meeting. My name is Neil Chi. I'm the co-director for the UCSD MD PhD program here at UCSD. Actually, I'm also in the division of cardiology along with Kevin in the Department of Medicine. I've been an alum of an MD PhD program, and particularly an MSTP. And actually, I think we have a couple of alums or soon to be alums. Evan's going to eventually be one soon enough. And we have, I think, another alum of our program here. So I'm excited to join you and answer any questions that you have about the physician scientist career track pathway.
Awesome. Happy to have you here, Dr. Shi. Thank you. And Dr. Minuki.
Right, and I don't know, Neil, if you were referring to me or not, but I'm a UCSD alum of the MSTP at UCSD, physician scientist, specifically a neuropathologist, and have my lab up at UCI, just up north, working on the pathology and stem cell modeling of the human choroid plexus in relation to brain aging and degeneration. I'm also the associate director of the MSTP at UCI. And in the Department of Pathology, one of the other hats I wear, I'm the chair of pathology and lab medicine, so I oversee the clinical laboratory.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Minuki. All right, we'll be transitioning into the main questions. First question is, describe the graduate program that you attended or attend or you run currently. Lots of options there, but besides the general curriculum, is there anything unique about the program that you run? And we'll start off with Dr. Minuki.
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple of ways I could answer that, but maybe most relevant to this audience with regards to the MSTP program at UCI. It in some ways is a traditional MSTP program where the graduate program and the PhD training is fit in the middle, in between the two parts of the medical school training. I guess one of the features of our program is that literally the entire campus, both the health sciences campus, but also the main campus, in a sense, are open for PhD training. And just as an example, we've had our first couple of students who have really done a true humanities PhD. One currently in English, another in philosophy, which is a little bit new for us. You know, we've had anthropology before. Literally the entire campus can be, if justified. So that's one aspect of it. Obviously, the graduate training in the different programs can be quite different, say in the engineering school versus physical sciences versus biological or biomedical sciences. So there's a lot of variety to kind of touch on. So maybe I'll just leave it there with regards to UCI.
Thank you. Dr. O'Donnell, if you want to speak about MTM.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I alluded to, my program's a little bit unique. My training is actually my undergraduate degree is in English, so I fully appreciate the idea of students going all over campus to take classes. My PhD is in biology, and my emphasis in my research was on the biomechanics of marine organisms. So how do snails hang onto rocks? Since I left that research field, I've been running this graduate program in translational medicine. And like I say, we're different than most medical science training in that we're not just looking at the research piece and how to push the bounds of knowledge. What we're really trying to focus on is how do you actually take that to patients? And by that, it's not that more research is needed. I mean, that may be the case or not, but there's an enormous amount of contextual work that goes on before even a valid idea can make it to patients. So we're spending a lot of time teaching our students about the regulatory aspects of healthcare innovation, about how money flows through the flows through the healthcare system, and how the workflows of the healthcare system will determine whether a good idea ever gets taken up. And so all of these we kind of think of them as the context in which healthcare innovation happens. And it does not matter how good your science is or how good your clinical experience is, if you ignore the regulatory and the financial aspects of it, you're very unlikely to have a new idea actually make it to patients. And so that's what we're really emphasizing in the MTM. And we actually get probably 10 to 20% of our students are practicing clinicians or medical residents who come in to take the program because they recognize that they want to learn how to change medicine as it's practiced. And probably 20% of our students go on to medical school afterwards, including a number who go on the MD PhD programs. But with that idea of I don't just want to come up with new research, I actually want it to take these things all the way through to completion. So that's the MTM in a nutshell. It's a one-year professional master's program that can really be either a terminal degree or a complement to a number of other training options.
Thank you. And Dr. Chi, if you want to talk about UCSD.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about the graduate programs here at UCSD, and Dr. King probably could talk a little bit more specifically about the bioengineering. I'll talk about the graduate program within the context of the MD PhD program. Some of you may or may not already know is actually with the MD PhD program, it's typically an 8-year program. And as mentioned, traditionally the idea is that you start with your MD portion first, your first 2 years, and then you go on to graduate school for another 3 to 4 years, and then you end with 2 years of your last year clinical years. And you obtain both your MD and your PhD, your dual degree within that 8-year period. As both UCI and the UCSD program are actually sponsored by the NIH, we are technically what we call a medical scientist training program, which is actually a MD PhD program that's supported specifically by the NIH. But in addition to the funds that we receive from the NIH, we actually have a substantial amount that actually comes from the institution for UCSD. Chancellor has been very gracious to support the program. So with a little bit more specifics about the graduate program, as Dr. Insel and I, and Dr. Insel, Paul Insel is the co-director of the program, and I think many of you know this, is that we're actually very much a full service campus. That is to say, actually, it's like very much like the UCI program. We have students that pretty much can go to any any graduate program on campus, and there's a lot of mixing and matching and within the graduate programs. And in fact, what's particularly interesting for UCSD is actually many of us have joint affiliations to different graduate programs. So you can do research in one program, or you could do research in one lab, in a particular lab, but actually have the choice of choosing from a few different graduate programs. And actually, Dr. Engler, the chair of bioengineering, actually oftentimes likes to tout that as a unique feature, at least for our MD PhD program. And beyond actually the faculty members where you can do the PhD at UCSD, you can actually do your PhD on any of the other labs, technically speaking, across the entire Mesa, which is to say Salk, Sanford Burnham, Scripps. So that's kind of another unique feature of our MD PhD program. And sometimes we like to think that our program is a little bit more than just the UCSD MSTP MD PhD program, but we actually like to think of it as the La Jolla Mesa-wide program. With regards to probably the interest that you folks might have, is actually some of you may already know that this is something actually, and Dr. King can get into this a little bit more, is that the bioengineering department has very close ties to health sciences, and it's actually a major mission across this entire campus, all the way probably from the chancellor downward, to actually see if there's ways to translate as much as possible in one particular key area is actually healthcare and medicine. So there are really close ties. There's always ways for us to do this. This is actually coming from both sides, bioengineering and health sciences, from both deans, Dean Garfin and the dean of the bioengineering department. There are efforts, some of you may be even involved in that, but that gets even raised to the higher level. There are actually joint ventures between the two areas, between health sciences and the engineering, from buildings that are built on the bioengineering campus that some of you know about, which is really cool, to actually a new building that'll be built over here on health sciences to foster those kinds of translational opportunities. So I'll leave it at that, and probably Dr. King might even be able to expound a little bit of some of the things within bioengineering more specifically, because that's a real wonderful way to really translate.
I don't have too much to add other than to say that that Neil's absolutely right, that Dr. Chi's right. You can do your PhD in any engineering discipline. There's really no barriers to that, and it's a really empowering spot to do graduate training, because when you walk around on the wards or when you see patients, you're going to come up with lots of ideas, and that's really distinct from your engineering colleagues that don't have that experience, that direct experience. So you're likely to be able to carve out a pretty interesting niche for yourself, and maybe just bring people together that wouldn't otherwise interact, even if you're not doing it directly. So certainly no barriers. I would say it's a really interesting place to kind of percolate. So certainly lean into that.
Yeah, just to add to the sort of the translational aspects where we're at, and again, many of you know, if you're from the UCSD area that's chiming in, is that there's a heavy biotech sector here. So there are quite a few folks on the campus where they're actually moving the translation to come to actually startups. And Dr. King may be one of those folks. The bioengineering folks always like to tout that pretty much all the faculty have some sort of company, and that's usually health care related. Of course, as Dr. McCulloch would always like to tell me, and some of you know Dr. McCulloch, whether they're successful or not, it's a different ballgame, but the opportunity is there. And in fact, some of the MD PhD students are actually doing that. Greg Poor just recently started something with Rob Knight on campus, and he's actually, and many of the MD PhDs are thinking along that line, not just in our program, probably nationally. And I wouldn't be surprised if we heard something like that at UCI.
Thank you for all that insight. We'll be moving on to the next question, particularly for students who are applying this cycle. How has the COVID-19 pandemic affected admissions to your programs? For example, is there more or less emphasis placed on in-person activities such as research or clinical work? How does that work? We can start with Dr. O'Donnell.
I have to say, we were bracing for that as we went through applications this year. Not a whole lot changed, really. I mean, we had great applications from students who had managed to do some level of research work under the pandemic. We got some fabulous letters of recommendation talking about how students pivoted their project and took it home with them and found ways to do computational stuff instead of bench work. So I think that emphasis on getting actual hands-on research experience hasn't really diminished. I'm going to be honest, we're a lot more flexible. We thought we're willing to be a lot more flexible about grades and things like that because we knew students had a hard time. But it looks to me from people's transcripts that got built in at the level of their home institution. And so we have not seen a major shift in really anything. I mean, I think that the good students found a way to make the pandemic interesting. Last year, our numbers, we have the largest class ever this year because during the pandemic, I think people flocked back to graduate school. And we had a lot of people hold off not wanting to do a remote year of graduate school. But looking at this year, it feels very much like our application process has gone back to normal. We're not seeing a huge COVID signal there, other than there's some weird transcripts that we have to read more carefully because they've got either no grades for a semester because that's what their school did, or that's the only term they had straight A's. We see lots of different models of how undergraduate careers were impacted, but we're not seeing a big need. I suspect that might be different for the more research or the medical school programs. Oh, one other thing I'll add. We eliminated standardized tests a couple of years ago. And I think this is going to be one of those things that a lot of schools are going to have to confront, because that was obviously hard for students to take those tests. We eliminated them before the pandemic, and we had virtually, even though every faculty complained a lot about that before we did it, no one has ever commented since they went away that, wow, it's really hard to evaluate these students without standardized test scores. So I suspect that trend is going to continue because they're really not that predictive of success.
Thank you for that response. Dr. Manuki.
Yeah, great. I mean, echoing Dr. O'Connell, I think we haven't seen that much of a change, any detectable difference in sort of the metrics, if you will. I think in terms of the sort of the holistic review process, I think one of the things that we have seen, and I think one of the things that the applicants are credited for, is that evidence for resilience in the face of COVID. So in some ways, every crisis is also an opportunity. From an applicant point of view, it's an opportunity to describe how you adapted to COVID and kind of maintain kind of the positive kind of productivity. And so I think that we see more of that certainly in the applications. I would say the biggest impact in some ways has been the increase in the number of applications shifting over to the virtual format. It's much easier for applicants to apply to multiple programs because the interview processes still are mostly virtual at this point. And so the number of applications has really skyrocketed. And so I think that, and of course, the dynamic of the virtual interview process is very different than the in-person. So I think the dynamics have changed in that sense. And those are the ways that I think the biggest changes we've seen here at UCI.
Awesome. All right, thank you. Similarly related question is, and this is for like Dr. Masutani or anybody else too, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected like the curriculum of the programs that you're in? For example, for Dr. Masutani, since you just did your PhD or yours, were you in lab less? What did you do, et cetera?
Right. So I was in a so I was fortunate in that the vast majority of my research was computational. Again, my thesis topic was on using artificial intelligence. So as it turns out, my work wasn't disrupted a huge amount just because I could just tunnel in to the lab servers or the cloud servers and just train my neural networks. So that was not so bad. I was impacted in other ways though. For example, like my defense was fully virtual, which honestly, because my family couldn't make the trip out here, that was perfectly fine by me, but just the little things here and there. And of course, coursework was largely virtual towards the end. I can't recall. No, I think I actually finished my coursework before the pandemic, but I do know that that was definitely a concern at the time. That being said, I do know very well some friends of mine in the class who definitely struggled doing bench work, like with mouse models or other things, just because the COVID pandemic made things particularly difficult to go in and out of the laboratory and all the other restrictions from there. It does seem like, at least at UCSD, things seem to be looking pretty good right now, but perhaps a bit of unsolicited advice for all new applicants would be, it's generally a good idea to pick up some computational chops. Because if you can take the work, if you can do the work from home or have some element of computational work, that'll only benefit you in the future. And it's a good, how should we say, fail-safe in case things don't work out as you plan, which they don't. Most of the time, life has a way of throwing curveballs at you.
Great, thank you for your response. So at this time, we'll be switching to the open Q&A so we can get some questions from our audience, and I'll be passing it on to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, John, for leading that Q&A session. Just to briefly introduce myself to everyone, my name is Rachel. I was in charge of this MD PhD panel for TMD 2 years ago. And I'm sure a few of the panelists remember kind of the chaos that was delivering the panel to an empty hall at the UCSD School of Medicine. I was TMD co-chair last year, and now I am retired TMD helper person. And I'll be kind of moderating this open Q&A session. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat. And John actually relayed a question over to me that he received over private message. So I guess we can start off with that. And the question is, are students required to have an engineering degree before going into any of these programs? So if anyone wants to answer that.
I can quickly chime in. I don't think necessarily that you need an engineering degree. I mean, we take pretty much, or at least the MD PhD program here at UCSD, probably likely for any MD PhD program, there's not really a requirement for having an engineering degree. I would say that, you know, it's helpful if you decide that you go to an MD PhD program, you want to continue maybe the path of engineering. That is to say, we do have students that don't have that background of engineering, but then they want to go into engineering. And so, you know, I think one has to proceed with caution because the engineers, I mean, all of you know, that's highly quantitative. And so you want to be sure that you have sufficient background to handle that. That being said, you know, with our MD PhD program, there's a lot of guidance. And so we do talk about these sort of things. I think Evan probably could be the first to tell you like that how helpful, I mean, I think he kind of hinted at this already, that it's very helpful to have that kind of background if you want to continue down that particular path. So, but you don't necessarily need engineering degree to apply to an MD PhD program.
And the same is the case at UCI. You certainly don't need, you know, in acceptance. You're accepted in some ways, both into the MD program and into the MSTP program concurrently. And here you're kind of concurrently registered as a graduate student and as a medical student the whole time. And so, and in some cases, for the more traditional schools, like School of Medicine and School of Biological Sciences, and at UCI also School of Engineering, there's a bit of sort of an automatic acceptance into the graduate programs. In the case of something like the humanities, there isn't. There has to be a little bit of work to convince, I think, the non-traditional schools to accept them into graduate programs. But for the traditional ones, there's a little bit of an automatic acceptance process. But part of it is just whether the research background and the research potential you show, you know, come through with the faculty that you rotate with. And then, so it's less about your specific degree than about your experience and, you know, sort of your how you do on your rotations and the research potential.
And Kevin, I don't know, were you about to say something?
I was just going to say that I would choose what you want to take your graduate courses on as what do you want to be an expert in foundationally, like what do you want to be broad and solid in. You're going to become very good at whatever your lab and your specific research focus is, but those courses will make you very broad and foundationally solid.
And to chime in on that too, just in terms of the breakdown, I can only speak for my own class because that's the only one I know exact numbers, but we have an extraordinarily large class size of 14. And only 2 out of those 14 ended up doing bioengineering. The rest do neurosciences, biomedical sciences, biology. So bioengineering as
And I was going to jump in and say, for our program, we absolutely do not require an engineering degree. And I think that probably 40 to 50% of our students have an engineering degree. Another 15 to 20% have a clinical background. And the rest generally either have life science backgrounds or weird backgrounds. We take every year someone with something that you would not expect. You know, here's someone with a political science background. Here's someone with a business background. And the point we make with that is that there's I think a feeling amongst a lot of people who go to undergraduate engineering programs, bioengineering programs, that they are going to be the ones who engineer the products that help medicine, and they're somehow going to be the bridge of that. And it's only partially true, because what really creates clinical innovation is not engineers doing what doctors tell them they need, and it's not doctors using the products that engineers think up. It's really teams of people working together. And within translational medicine, as we teach it in our master's program at Berkeley and UCSF, the emphasis is on teaching those teams to work together. And probably the most impactful thing is watching a group of engineers suddenly realize that they have no real idea what the doctors are hoping for. And the doctors are usually more aware of that and are fascinated to talk to the engineers. But when those groups learn each other's language, it's often the life scientists who form a great bridge between them and are able to do the interviews, to do needs finding, often more effectively than the engineers, because they're not looking for a solution. They're more aware of their lack of understanding. And for things like business side, that has no real need to be either a doctor or an engineer. So I think there's a lot of room within translational medicine for anything that's got sufficient quantitative abilities to handle the discussion that's going on, but that learning the language is really a big part of what's going to make success in translational projects.
Thank you, panelists, for your answers. Victor, I see you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, so thank you, doctors, for your insights. I had a question about a person with MD PhD degree in general. Do you think if the person wanted to, do you think if a person with MD PhD can interact with patients a lot? Because while I want to spend majority of my time researching, I also think it'll be super rewarding to interact with patients a lot and feel the gratitude, apply my researches. So yeah.
Well, I can give an initial, my 2 cents on that. I think there's a few different ways to think about that. I think one of them is sort of in a sense, the national funding scope of what gets supported for physician scientists as junior faculty. And the typical, say, NIH awards, say like the KO8, that type of thing. For most physician scientists, those are awarded only if the candidate has at least 75% protected time for the research. The exception to that is for surgeons. I think that there has been a shift where the NIH does allow for more of a 50-50 type split. But that partly that's because of the declining the workforce projections of physician scientists going down so quickly. That they made that accommodation, also accommodation to sort of the healthcare economics, and then kind of the drive to have the surgeons in the ORs as much as possible. But so with that, as in general, I think what physician scientists try to do is they often really absolutely adore and rely on that continued patient contact, but they carve out a particular niche of that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
Right, to synergize with the research or the particular research interest. So that's the way that most physician scientists typically carve out their clinical research paths. That's what's supported by NIH and other extramural funding agencies as well, is still to have the majority of time protected for research.
I see. Thank you,
It's
Dr.
very discipline specific. So some will divide their time where you do a half day a week or a day a week of clinic. Others, like in my case, I do contiguous, roughly 2 weeks at a time, just because you get to know the patients and then you continuously do that. So my lab's sort of aware when I'm going to go on service, we kind of prepare for that. And then when I'm off service, nobody thinks I'm their doctor. But there's all kinds of different ways to do this, but definitely one of the most compelling reasons to train in to go to medical school is to take care of patients. So there's lots of ways you can do it.
Oh, that's relieving. Thank you.
I think that just to chime in, because I was to add a little bit more to that. I think it was well said by the two previous panelists with regards to actually seeing patients. I still see patients. I'm like Dr. King myself. I spend 10-20% of my time in the CCU, and it is very much dependent on the department and your discipline and your interest, and you can work these things out. It's actually, you can be quite creative depending on what your discipline is. I also think that there was, I think Dr. O'Donnell kind of mentioned this, was kind of interesting, is that physician scientists, we actually starting to work more and more in teams. So there's the traditional path that Dr. Manuki talked about, and it's true with the KO8, that the thought is traditionally it's about 80-20, which is actually sort of the split you're hearing probably from Dr. King, myself, and probably other physician scientists. But it's really interesting that we're seeing really interesting ways that people can use the dual degree. And so those numbers, the percentage, I wouldn't get really too caught up on. It really kind of depends on sort of your interest. It is true that some of this is oftentimes driven a little bit by the NIH, but we're really seeing that the students are really coming up with interesting ways to use their time. You guys are just a generation that knows how to use time in a way that might be a little bit, that kind of breaks the mold. Actually, it's been really cool to see how everybody kind of does their thing, and then at the end of the day is translating, whether it's doing themselves, like or actually working within a team and not necessarily having those 80-20 splits. So it's an interesting and good question, and maybe I would have, we would have answered this differently 10-20 years ago, but it's always a dynamic thing with regards to how physician scientists actually balance their time, and with the eventual goals, can we translate?
Maybe just a follow-up. I think that's a really great perspective for the folks listening in. The traditional models are clearly becoming adapting, and there's room for creativity, I suppose, on the individual physician scientists themselves on how they kind of carve that out, because typically, even though and part of it is just for the simplicity of communication, we talk about an 80-20 split because it's sort of easy to conceptualize roughly what that looks like, but it is extremely rough. Extremely rough, and can be defined in different ways. And nobody is really bookkeeping or accounting their time. Right? That's just not the way that we work or the way that things are successful. So, so I wouldn't be constrained by that. I think the 80-20 rule is, for me, a good one to keep in mind. But I think the point about the flexibility and the being creativity and how this generation is using their time in different and maybe increasingly multidisciplinary and efficient ways, I think is an extremely important point.
Thank you for your words. Yeah, MD PhD looks even more attractive now.
Glad to hear that too.
All right, thank you all for your insight. I got another direct message from someone who is asking about strong characteristics of a strong applicant or a successful application to your programs. any of the admissions want to hop in on that one?
I'll jump in and talk what I think is important, not just for my program, but I think it's kind of universal. Like I say, I read a ton of applications, and a lot of them are clearly someone's med school application that they repurpose for my program. And what I tell everyone who's applying to graduate school is think of your application as a story. It's not a form to the DMV. It's not, you just check all these boxes and you get in. You are telling a story with every aspect of that application. And I don't think students emphasize that enough. So for instance, the UC applications typically have 2 essays. One's a personal, a statement of purpose, and one's a personal history statement. And I cannot tell you how often I get virtually the same essay for both of those. It's a student who is like, no, this is the point I really want to make. So I'm going to tell it from, as a history, and I'm going to tell the same story. That's a wasted opportunity to tell a different aspect of you. Somebody mentioned holistic application review, which is what we say in the University of California. That's what we do. And I think most schools do that. We want to know who you are, what you want to accomplish, and whether our program can help you. We're not looking to weed you out. We're looking to say, is this student going to be a member of our learning community that's really going to help? And we learn that from these essays. And so I suggest to everyone that the statement of purpose should be where you want to go with this graduate degree, and the personal history statement should be what brought you to this point. But just make sure you're not using the same story for both. But a point that I really want to make, because I think a lot of people miss this, is your letters of recommendation are a huge element of your application, and they're often neglected. I think students feel like their job in letters of recommendation is just to ask someone to write them, and then they're done. That's another huge mistake, because I end up with a lot of letters that don't really complement the story that the student's trying to tell. I get a lot of letters, and this is something back to the question about what COVID is going to change. I think letter writing is going to get hard for the next few years because you haven't had the same contact with faculty. And that's going to require work on the part of students. Those of you who are not, about to graduate should really make an effort to reach out to faculty members. And I really advise people not to do it based on, hey, will you write me a letter? But based on, hey, I'd like to talk a little bit more about what I learned in your class, or I'd like to talk more about how what we talked about in that lab meeting relates to my ultimate career objectives. If you have those, you're really cultivating these letters of recommendation. If you're not actually interested in that information, you probably don't deserve a good letter anyway. But if you really do go to a faculty member and talk to them about the research that they discussed, or the work you did in the lab and how that relates to your career, that will be reflected in your letter of recommendation. I see it over and over again. If the best you think a faculty member can give you in a letter of recommendation is, Moose was a student in my class. It's a very hard class. There were 180 students. He got an A-. That means he's a very talented student. I'm sure he'll do great in graduate school. I get probably 20% of the letters I get look like that. They don't do you any harm, but they don't actually help you either. If that's the best you can see, if that's the best you think a professor can write you a letter for, I'd look elsewhere. The letters that change your application tenor are, Rachel came to my lab as a sophomore, and I don't accept sophomores in my lab, but she'd actually read a bunch of our papers, and she was super excited about the research and had such great questions that I made an exception. And since she got there, she's actually revamped a couple of our protocols that now our graduate students use. During COVID, she actually took a bunch of analysis home that we've been meaning to get to, and she'll probably be the author on a publication within the next year. I get those letters too. Those letters get you into graduate school, straight up, because people look at that and say, wow, a faculty member actually, this student made a real impression, and a very positive impression. And so think about that as you try to do undergraduate research. Try to think about, how can I have the interactions that lead to this? It's not about just going to office hours and hoping someone notices you. It's about being a good part of the learning community. So that's that has nothing specific to my program. The same advice will help you in any graduate program you do. But really think about, how do you get those letters of recommendation?
So
Anyone wants to- yeah.
No,
Go ahead, Doc.
Well, yeah, I thought actually Dr. O'Connell's point about letter writing and in the COVID era, I think is a really good point. The letters are very important in the application process, and that could be more challenging. And the effort to actually interact with your letter writers probably is a way to distinguish the quality of the letters that they will be able to write for you. And so I do think that's a good piece of advice. For the MD PhD programs, I think just very quickly, the applicants need to be competitive for medical school because they're reviewed separately by the medical school admission. So, but for MD PhD, that means that they kind of need, in addition to the usual criteria, they need to have some clinical exposure, but they don't need to have a ton of clinical exposure. So don't necessarily need as much clinical exposure as a MD only applicant, but they want to see that you've really tested that out and you know what you're getting yourselves into, and that you are really driven by that as well. And then it's really all about the research side, the research experience. And really, I think what we're all looking for is kind of the quality and depth of research experience, and then insight that comes through in all those parts of the different application, your statements, the letters from your advisors, about kind of that research potential. And by that, not only having a control of sort of the technical aspects of your work, but really having control of your projects, intellectual, organizational, to some extent, supervising other students, writing, maybe involvement in the writing process, those parts, and if that has led to a publication, that's great. But not required, but that is sort of in some ways can be evidence of having had some involvement. But yeah, the way that kind of research potential really resonates across the entire application is really what I think what many of us look for in the MD PhD space. Neil or Kevin want to comment on it.
Kevin, do you want to chime in first?
Yeah, I think those are great points. One thing I noticed is that sometimes you can read enough books and about this process that you can feel like there are right answers. And I would really, discourage you. You're trying to come across as very authentic to yourself. And sometimes you need to talk with people and they can help you understand what's most interesting about your story. You've been so close to it that can be helpful. And I guess similar to the other panelists' points, I think there's really two elements that you're looking for here. One is somebody who's really committed and, after those really long shifts is still going to try and be putting in the effort. They just care incessantly about their work. But then there's also that creative part, that project leadership part, that I think if you only do what you're told during these research experiences, and same with clinical experiences, you won't shine. So when you're shadowing, and you're asked to help a patient with something, ask them questions like, when did they come into the hospital? How did they know they needed to be in the hospital? You can start practicing those interview skills, and it's just going to make you much more comfortable, and you'll do that self-exploration. Do I want to do medicine? And then when you're in the lab, read papers about the work you're doing. Don't just follow what you're told to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can add too much more. I mean, it's really wonderful suggestions. And I fully agree with everything that's said. I think that just to reiterate, we are looking for holistic applications. As you can only imagine with a dual degree, you're pretty much really spanning both sides. As Dr. McNukie mentioned, actually, something I think sometimes that gets lost for the MD PhD applicant is the clinical aspects. So please don't forget about that part. We don't expect you to have a ton because, I always am amazed looking at these applications, how any of you actually are able to juggle all of it. see really incredible hours from both sides. But you really, the research side, we know that that's going to take a little bit more time, so it's going to take away from the clinical. But sometimes we see applications where we don't really see any clinical experiences. And Dr. Minuki says it still has to pass the medical schools. They have to be comfortable that you've made an educated decision into the medical career pathway, let alone the physician scientist career pathway, which is what we're looking at. So don't forget that. Something that's an intangible that was raised, I think, by Dr. Minuki, that's always tough to actually capture is the resilience. That's probably the key feature, actually, of this career pathway, because there's a lot of ups and downs. But at the end of the day, it's an incredibly rewarding career pathway. And so being able to have the ability to stick it out, and be able to go through tough times to get to that really amazing time, and the final outcome is really key for us. And then, the big one is actually the research experience and the letters. And come back to the letters. The way to look at it is if you do have a really rich experience of research where you're driving it as the actual research, as Dr. King is kind of mentioning, what that translates to is it's very easy for the letter writer actually to say that you drove it, right? And that's really impressive. And that's, I think, like what Dr. O'Donnell is kind of mentioning, that strong letter can be really written on your behalf, actually. So probably many of you are doing this already, but that's the things that we're kind of looking at. In some ways, I always like to say, what we're looking for, and particularly with the research experience and even the clinical experience, is sometimes a little bit more depth and breadth. And sometimes students make the mistake that they do a little bit here, a couple months here, a couple months there. But then you can imagine that shallow experience is hard to write a real strong letter of recommendation. So at least for us in the MD PhD program at UCSD, oftentimes those are the kinds of applications that percolate a little bit more at the top.
I want to throw out one more thing that I talk to a lot of students who are talking about wanting an MD PhD or a PhD, and I'm often surprised at how often nothing they say makes me think they should get a PhD. And so ask yourself, really, why do I want this? And is it because it's the cool degree, it's the upper echelon of the hard degrees? On the research side, everything that Dr. Chi was just saying about how to shine in research, you should be doing that not because it will get you a better letter, but because that's your passion. And if you're in a lab saying, gosh, I know I got to work a little harder or I'll get a crappy letter, you should probably leave then. If you're saying, I'm going to stay here all night because if I don't figure this out, I'm going to go crazy, then you're in the right place. I tell people who are thinking about a PhD program, if you're looking at a lab you'd like to work in, go print out a whole stack of papers from that lab and put them on your bedside and try to read them on a Friday night. And if you can think of anything else to do and you never get those papers read because you've always got something more fun to do on a Friday night, you don't want to go work in that lab. You don't want to research in that field. If you're pissed off that the library is closed and you can't follow up some of the leads you read in those papers, then you've found it. Then you're set. And so that is far more important than anything you can possibly, learn from a panel like this or talking to people who say how great an MD PhD is do I want to do this research no matter what? So think that through before you're like, yeah, I got to do this.
All right, well, in the interest of time, that will be the last response for this session of TMD. I just want to thank the panelists again so much for your time and your wonderful insight. I know that I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure that everyone here who attended also did. So we really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to come talk to us. And you're always invited back to our future events if that's something that you're open to. And to all the students, thank you for coming. We hope you learned something. And yeah, we'll be transitioning into our networking session starting in just a minute. So if presenters are able to stick around for that, you're certainly welcome to, but if you do have to go, we understand. And yeah, we hope to see you soon.